I always thought the hardest part of losing my father would be the funeral, the final goodbye, the silence after everyone else had gone home. But no, none of that compared to what came after. I was sitting in his old recliner when it happened. The sun was spilling across the hardwood floors, dust floating in the still air, and the house, it felt too big, too empty. I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out his pocket watch. Brass, well-worn, engraved with the words, "Honor over all." That was my father. A man who believed in legacy, in doing what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. My younger brother Thomas stood by me that day, dressed in our father's gray suit. He looked every bit the dependable man our family believed him to be. "Don't worry, Linda," he said softly as he squeezed my shoulder. "I'll take care of everything from here." And I believed him. Of course I did. I always believed in Thomas. We'd grown up just the two of us after our mother passed. Me at 11, him at 6. I was more than a sister. I was his second mom, his protector. I taught him how to ride a bike, helped with every school project, even gave up my scholarship to stay close to home when Dad got sick the first time. I did what big sisters do. I kept our world together. So when our father named Thomas executor of the estate, I didn't question it. He had the financial experience. He was the practical one. And honestly, after 30 years of teaching and caregiving, I was ready to rest. For a while, everything seemed fine. I spent my days volunteering at the library, leading a knitting circle at church, and sipping tea on the porch with Richard, my husband of 32 years. Life felt calm again, until the morning Richard came into the kitchen with a manila folder in one hand and a look I hadn't seen since his mother died. "Linda," he said, "I think something's wrong with the family account." I smiled, thinking it was a banking error, a misplaced decimal. "I'm sure it's nothing," I told, him pouring his coffee like I always did. "Thomas is handling it." He looked at me, not the way a husband looks at a wife, but the way a father might look at a child who's about to learn something painful. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "I don't think Thomas is who you think. He is." And just like that, the floor beneath my peaceful life began to shift. Have you ever believed in someone so completely that when the cracks start to show, you'd rather close your eyes than face the truth? Have you ever protected someone you love, only to discover they were the one undoing everything you were trying to hold together? Let me know in the comments if this story is already hitting home for you. And if you've ever had to choose between protecting family and protecting your peace, I'd love to hear how you handled it. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what Linda discovers next, because trust me, it gets worse before it gets better. I wanted so badly for Richard to be wrong. I wanted to believe it was a clerical mistake or some misunderstanding. Maybe a delay in transferring funds or a payment Thomas had forgotten to mention. That's what I told myself as I opened the family account on my laptop later that afternoon, hands trembling ever so slightly. But the numbers didn't lie. Nearly $200,000. Gone. Gone. The withdrawals had started not long after our father passed. Small amounts at first. Unnoticeable, really. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. But they grew. 5,000, 10, 15, all labeled under vague descriptions like estate fees, professional services, or asset relocation, and always authorized by Thomas. I scrolled through the statements again and again, looking for some line item that would make it make sense, but there wasn't one. Just a slow, steady siphoning of the inheritance our parents worked their whole lives to build, I didn't know whether to scream or cry. I didn't know who I was angrier at. Thomas for what he'd done, or myself for not noticing sooner. Richard stood quietly in the doorway as I sat there, frozen. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't gloat. He just walked over, rested a hand on my shoulder, and whispered, "We'll figure this out, together." I wanted to believe him, but the truth was, nothing felt solid anymore. The next morning I confronted Thomas. I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my voice. I asked him as calmly as I could to explain the missing funds. He blinked, looked away, then laughed, like I'd just accused him of stealing candy from a church bake sale. "Come on, Linda. You really think I'd take from the family?" I didn't answer. His face hardened. "You've known me my whole life. You think I'm a thief?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to scream no, but all I could do was stare at him, at the way his jaw clenched, how his eyes darted, never quite meeting mine. And suddenly, I saw not my little brother, but a man hiding something. "You know what?" he said, shaking his head. "This is because of Richard. He's always looked at me like I'm some kind of charity case. And now he's got you convinced I'm the villain in my own family." I whispered. "Then prove me wrong. Show me the records." Thomas didn't respond. He walked away. And I stood there in the driveway, my feet rooted to the ground, heart pounding in my ears. It was the first time in my life that my brother had left me, standing in the dark, and not turned back. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I tossed and turned, the sheets wrapped around my legs like vines I couldn't untangle. I kept replaying the look on Thomas's face, the shift from indignant to defensive to something far more dangerous. Cold. At 3:17 a.m., I got out of bed, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with the old leather-bound journal I used to keep when I was still teaching. I hadn't written in it since retirement, but that night, I needed something solid, some place to pour the weight sitting on my chest. I wrote, "If this had been a stranger, I'd have called the police by now, but it's Thomas, my Thomas." By morning, the doubt had settled into my bones. I started looking deeper. Not out of suspicion, at least not at first. More like desperate hope that I'd find something to prove Richard wrong. Something to absolve Thomas. Instead, I found a new credit card statement. It had been tossed into the recycling bin without being opened. That's what caught my eye. Inside, luxury hotel bookings, high-end electronics, a payment to a private poker club 3 towns over, and none of it lined up with the modest paycheck Thomas earned from the real estate firm he worked for part-time. I sat on the porch steps with the envelope in my lap, staring into the morning mist. The oak tree in the backyard, the one Thomas and I used to climb as kids, swayed gently in the breeze. I remembered how we used to play spaceship in its highest branches, pretending we were astronauts flying to Jupiter. How I'd bandage his scrapes and lie to Dad when he got hurt so Thomas wouldn't get in trouble. I'd always protected him, and I'd always believed that love meant never turning away. But what if love, real love, meant holding someone accountable when they'd lost their way? Richard didn't say much when I handed him the credit card bill, just gave a long exhale and a quiet nod. "I think it's time," he said. "We need to talk to him again. With everything on the table." I nodded, and for the first time I realized that doing the right thing didn't always feel good. Sometimes it felt like grieving a person who was still standing right in front of you. We agreed to meet at Dad's house. Neutral ground. Familiar ground. Thomas pulled up in his usual denim jacket and sunglasses, trying to look casual, as if this were just another Sunday drop-by. But I could see the tightness in his jaw, the stiffness in his walk. He knew. Richard was already inside, his briefcase on the coffee table, papers organized and clipped neatly in a manila folder. Thomas barely glanced at him. "Linda," he said, with a strained smile. "You didn't have to drag him into this again." I didn't respond. I simply sat down and folded my hands in my lap. Richard took a seat across from him, opened the folder, and spoke with the same voice he used when he testified in court years ago during a company audit. Calm, precise, unshakable. "These are the documents, Thomas," he said. "Bank transfers, credit card charges, your signature on every transaction. We've cross-referenced the dates with the estate records. The total misappropriated so far exceeds $200,000. Thomas stared at the papers, then looked up at me, his eyes suddenly glassy. "You're really going to treat me like some kind of criminal?" My voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't want to believe it, Tommy. God knows I tried. He stood suddenly, knocking his chair back. "I did what I had to do. You have no idea what it's like, always being the one who fell short. You were always the good one, Dad's favorite, the responsible one, the perfect teacher, the perfect wife. Me, I was just the screw-up who needed saving. I got tired of it." Richard's voice was steady. "And so you stole." Thomas spun toward him, pointing a finger. "Don't you dare judge me. You've never had to live under someone else's shadow your whole life." I stood. My hands were shaking, but my voice held. "We all carry something, Thomas, but we don't all use it as an excuse to betray the people who love us." He sank back into the chair, suddenly smaller than before. "I was drowning," he muttered. "I thought if I could just fix it. Just one more investment, just one more win. I could make it right before anyone noticed." "But you didn't," I said. And now here we are. The room went silent except for the soft tick of Dad's old clock on the mantel. Thomas wiped his face with the back of his hand. "What are you going to do?" I looked at Richard. He gave me a small nod. But this decision, it had to be mine. I turned back to Thomas. "I don't know yet," I said quietly. "But I do know this. I can't protect you from the consequences anymore. Not this time." And for the first time in our lives, my little brother didn't argue. I spent the rest of that evening sitting alone in the backyard, under the old oak tree where Thomas and I used to play. The breeze rustled the branches above, casting long shadows across the grass. It was a tree that had withstood storms, lightning, drought, and still it stood. I thought about our father, about the way he used to oil that old pocket watch every Sunday, winding it with care. "You can't stop time," he used to say, "but you can honor it." I felt like time had caught up with us all. The next morning, Richard made coffee while I stared at the kitchen table, still not sure what kind of sister, what kind of woman I needed to be now. "We have 3 choices," Richard said gently. 1, we go to the authorities. 2, we try to recover the money quietly through mediation. 3, we let it go, but live with the damage. Option 3 is not an option, I said quietly. He nodded. "I know what you're thinking," I added. "That it should be simple. That justice is black and white." "It's not simple, Linda," he said. "And it's never black and white. But it is necessary." Later that day, I met with an old friend, Marie, a retired counselor, who had worked with families dealing with addiction and financial betrayal. She listened, didn't interrupt, just let me spill everything. When I finished, she said something that settled into my chest like a stone. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is stop shielding them from the truth. That night, I called Thomas and asked him to come over. He sounded tired, beaten down. Maybe he was. He sat across from me in the living room, fidgeting with the seam of the couch cushion like a schoolboy. "Need to say something," I began. "And I need you to really hear me. Not as your sister, but as someone who still loves you too much to lie to you." His eyes lifted. "You've broken our trust, Thomas. Not just mine. Dad's, Richard's, the whole family's. But you're not beyond redemption. That's up to you now." He looked away. "So what happens next?" "I want you to turn yourself in," I said, "and I'll be there with you. But this," I gestured to the pile of documents beside me, "can't be hidden. Not anymore." His face hardened, the way it always did when he felt cornered. "You're choosing him over me." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm choosing the truth, for both of us." He didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, silent, wounded. But for the first time, he didn't walk away. Thomas called me 2 days later. His voice was quiet, stripped of all the bravado, all the defenses, just raw. "I'll do it," he said, "but I need you there." And I was. I sat beside him in a stiff chair at the sheriff's office, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, while he confessed to the misappropriation of funds. I watched him sign papers with the same hand that used to reach for mine when he was scared of thunderstorms. They agreed to reduce the charges if he enrolled in a rehabilitation program for compulsive gambling and began restitution. As we walked out into the sunlight, he stopped just before the curb. "Do you hate me?" he asked. I turned to face him. "I hate what you did, but I don't hate you." He gave the smallest nod. "That's more than I deserve." After that day, the town whispered. People who used to wave at me from across the street now looked away. Church friends grew quiet when I walked into the sanctuary. There were glances, pitying and judgmental in equal measure. But I held my head high. I had done the right thing. We had done the right thing. At home, Richard and I started mending the quiet distance that had crept between us. One night, over dinner, he said, "You know, I didn't think you'd go through with it. Not because you're weak, but because you care too much." "I do care," I said. But I realized, caring doesn't mean covering. It means standing in truth even when it costs you everything. Thomas began the recovery program that same week. Twice a week, he checked in with a counselor. He started attending financial accountability meetings. It wasn't easy. There were days he called me angry, days he didn't call at all. But then there were quiet Sundays when he'd show up at the back porch, hands in his pockets, and just sit with me. Not much was said, but I think we both knew. That kind of silence was healing. One afternoon, he surprised me with something, a thick envelope, sealed with masking tape. "I sold the car," he said, "and a few watches. This is a start." Inside was a check, not even close to what he owed. But it wasn't about the money. It was about taking responsibility. That night, I found my old journal again. I wrote one line. Justice gave me peace, but accountability gave me back my brother. 6 months later, the air felt different. The weight that had been pressing on our family had shifted. Lighter in some places, still heavy in others. but no longer unbearable. Thomas had completed his rehabilitation program. He was working again. Nothing glamorous, just a part-time job at a local hardware store. But he was showing up, on time, every day, no excuses. He still hadn't paid back the full amount. That would take years, maybe longer. But every month, without fail, I received a hand-delivered envelope. No fanfare, no long notes, just a receipt, a check, and a quiet nod. One evening, I decided it was time to do something I'd been avoiding. I gathered the family, what was left of us, Richard, my cousin Elise, Uncle Marvin, and Thomas. We sat in the sunroom of our father's house, the one we hadn't sold, the one we'd kept hoping to fill with memories again. Thomas stood awkwardly in the center of the room. He cleared his throat. "I owe you all more than I can ever repay," he said, voice low but steady. "Not just money, trust, dignity, family." He paused, then looked at me. "Especially you, Linda." I met his eyes. I let everyone down. I made choices that hurt people who loved me the most, and I don't expect anyone to forgive me tonight. But I needed to say it, out loud. I'm sorry. No one clapped, no one cried. It wasn't that kind of moment. But something shifted. Uncle Marvin gave a small nod. Elise reached for Thomas's hand, and Richard, to my quiet surprise, stood and offered him a chair. That night, Thomas and I sat under the oak tree again for the first time in years. We didn't talk much, just watched the wind through the leaves, the way we used to when the world felt safer. "Dad would have been proud of you," I said softly. Thomas let out a breath. "I hope so." I glanced up at the sky, stars blinking faintly through the dusk. "He believed in redemption, you know, but only when it was earned." Thomas nodded. "Then I guess I'll just keep earning it." And for the first time in a long time, I believed he might. 1 year later, I stood beneath a canopy of autumn leaves in the town square, watching people pass by with coffee cups and weekend newspapers tucked under their arms. It had been a long, quiet year of rebuilding, brick by brick, truth by truth. Thomas now ran a small bookkeeping service from home. Nothing big, nothing flashy, but honest. For the first time in decades, I saw pride in his shoulders when he spoke about his work. Not the kind born of ego, but the kind that comes from doing right, quietly, every single day. Richard and I were stronger too. Not perfect. We'd had our scars to tend to. But there was something sacred about the way we had weathered the storm together. Something solid that couldn't be shaken by whispers or broken trust. We still lived in the same house, still drank our morning coffee on the porch, only now the silence between us was different. Not strained, just peaceful. That fall I started a small support group at the local library for families facing financial betrayal. I called it the Ledger Circle. Once a month we sat in a circle, teachers, nurses, retired plumbers, sharing stories we thought we'd carry alone. And somehow, through the telling, the shame lost its power. One evening, Thomas surprised me by attending a meeting. He didn't speak much, but when a man across the circle choked up mid-sentence, Thomas offered him a glass of water with a quiet, steady hand. Later that night, as we walked out under the parking lot lights, he turned to me. "I don't think I'll ever fully forgive myself." "You're not supposed to forget," I said. "You're supposed to grow." He looked down, then nodded. "I'm trying." We drove to the cemetery that weekend, together. At our father's grave, we stood side by side. The headstone was simple, just his name, the dates, and one line etched beneath, honor over all. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something, wrapped in cloth. It was the old pocket watch, our father's. He set it gently at the base of the stone. "I'm not ready to carry it yet," he said, "but I will be." I placed my hand on his shoulder, and for the first time in years, I felt something steady between us, something unbroken. Maybe we don't choose the families we're born into, but we do choose who we become within them. And sometimes, the bravest kind of love is the one that demands accountability and still chooses to believe in redemption. What would you do if the person you protected your whole life turned out to be the one who betrayed you most? Linda's story reminds us that true love sometimes means holding someone accountable, and that redemption isn't about perfection, but responsibility. Have you ever had to choose between doing the right thing and protecting someone you love? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe to Sophia's Revenge Stories, where every story dares to tell the truth hidden behind closed doors.